Okay. So before you're starting your own project, it's important to understand what already exists in your area of interest, right? And we accomplish this by reading research papers. Reading research papers allows you to figure out what's already been done in that field, what's worked, what's failed, and where, most importantly, where the gaps in current knowledge are. They're also pretty useful for helping you narrow your topic because oftentimes we'll start with something pretty broad, maybe something like neuroscience or climate change. But then by reading these much narrower papers, they kind of show you how professionals can break these huge ideas into more specific and testable questions, which is basically exactly what you want your project to be based around, right? Much more narrow fields within these large, like bigger areas, right? And when you're reading these projects, you're not necessarily expected to really understand every single like methodology or part of the paper, right? But it's more important that you're able to pull out key trends and key ideas in what's actually going on, right? Because you physically just can't be expected to know as much as maybe a PhD student, or someone working in academia or the industry, right? But just being able to understand some of these main ideas and understanding the trends can really give you something like a point to kind of jump off of from in order to inspire your own project. Okay. Um, so the foundation for most of these scientific research papers that you'll read or even your own projects is the scientific method, which is shown in this flowchart, right? So even though many of these research papers can look super long and super complicated, they usually all follow this like same basic structure. And these scientists are following this process to make sure their work is clear and very well organized, right? So when scientists are actually writing their papers, um, in reality, they're kind of just explaining how they followed this process step by step so that other students and other researchers can understand exactly what they did and really better understand the reasoning behind why they did what they did, right? So because all research papers are modeled around this structure, basically understanding it is pretty important to being able to read research papers, right? Okay. And then within research papers, there's two main types, right? There's, oh, sorry, not sorry. Within scientific papers, there's two different types, right? There's research papers, which are where scientists are collecting and analyzing new data and doing and performing their own experiments and making their own observations, usually seen in more cutting edge or new research being done, while review papers are a little different, and because they look at and mainly summarize many studies that have already been published. And both are pretty useful for us, but they serve different purposes. Review papers are more useful for us when we're just starting out on a topic, right? Because they help you understand the more broad and more general information in terms of what's already known in these larger fields, and they can help us identify interesting places of interest, right? But then research papers are more helpful once you've already gotten that general idea, and because they help you show how scientists are really designing and testing these ideas and really help you narrow down your kind of focus, right? And then when you're developing your own research project, these review papers help you choose and understand a topic, while research papers really figure out how to investigate it further and go deeper and deeper. Okay. And then most research articles follow a standard structure, kind of similar to the scientific method we talked about. So once you learn it, scientific papers become much, much easier to read. And each section itself has like specific purposes within the article. So then understanding what each of these sections is about can really help with reading through a lot of research quickly, right? Because you're able to really identify if a research paper is worth reading or if it's worth your time without really wasting too much time on reading like unhelpful jargon, right? Okay. So first is the abstract, which is typically the first section of a research paper that the readers will see, right? It's kind of I'd say a brief snapshot of the entire study where it summarizes all of the most important information from the actual paper into one short paragraph. So readers can pretty quickly decide whether the paper is relevant to what they need to know. And then within an abstract, there's typically four main elements. There's the objective, or also the research question, basically what the study itself is trying to investigate. Then there's the methodology, how the actual research was conducted, maybe talking about like experimental procedures, surveys, or data analysis. And then thirdly, there's the key results, basically the most important findings, without going into like too much detail. And then lastly, the conclusion or significance, basically taking these important findings and explaining what they mean and really why they matter to us. The abstract is meant to be succinct, not really to include a lot of background history or citations or detailed explanations or anything like that. It's just focused on being very clear and as concise as possible, while still containing all of the like relevant, important information of the paper. And then for a reader, especially for people like us who are planning our own science fair projects, right? The abstract is pretty helpful because it lets us learn a lot about the paper really quickly without really investing that much time into it. And allows us to choose whether that paper is really worth going further into or maybe disregarding, right? Okay. Then there's the introduction. Um, So the introduction's job is to basically help the reader understand what this research is about and why it really matters to them, right? It provides all the background information needed to understand the topic as well. So it's basically explaining key concepts and important terms that are referenced throughout the paper that without that context, the reader wouldn't really understand, right? So reading the introduction is essential to reading the rest of the paper as well, because without understanding what it's even about, or like what even these like most basic concepts are, the actual complex parts of the paper will be like indecipherable, right? The introduction itself also outlines the current problem that's faced or the gap in knowledge, kind of like the purpose of the research, basically explaining what scientists know or what they don't, and how this paper will accomplish like understanding this gap, right? And then most introductions will also include like the hypothesis or the main goal of the study as well, basically telling the reader what the researcher is expecting to find or what like question they're trying to answer.
Okay, then now that brings us to the methods or methodology section. So it essentially just describes how a certain study was carried out. So the procedure, some key materials used, and some of like the different techniques, if you want to call it, like if you're trying to do a chemistry project, maybe distillation would be one of the methods that you use to obtain your data. If you're doing like an AI project, back propagation with neural networks is another topic that you might or another concept that you might want to talk about in the method section. So essentially, it's just at a very high level, it's just using existing techniques to help carry out your research. And you just list out your procedure basically in the method section. And the method section is super important because it helps for replicability. So if you were to make your research into a research paper and publish it, you want other researchers to essentially just look at your method section, understand what you did so that they can replicate it and get similar results if they do that themselves, right? So, on that same thought, you want to be very specific in your method section. So you want to name the exact procedure you used and you want to cite where you got that procedure from. So if, for example, you're using distillation as a process, you basically just cite the source where you got that information from, the method, the technique, so that people or other researchers can look at that and it'll help them replicate that same experiment that you've done. So that's why the method section is important. And we're gonna talk more about this section on day 3, actually designing your procedure and methods. So you don't have to worry about that too much right now. And then the results section. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but this is the actual data, the raw data that you collect through your experiment. Uh, there's basically just two main types that we want to go over. The first one's quantitative data, so it's actually like numerical results. So for example, if you're measuring like the height of a plant, like or plant growth, you can maybe map or you can plot that it grew 10 centimeters over time. And that could be like one type of data point that you collect. And then qualitative data is just observations that you collect. So, for example, if a plant becomes pink, if it turns a different color, or basically just anything that you can see, feel, or touch, that's basically just qualitative. So it doesn't really have to do with numbers. Those are like the main two types of data. And like I said before, data is often visualized in graphs or like data tables because obviously like if you collect your actual data, you need a place to visualize it because if other people just look at a data set, they're not going to be able to decipher it. But if you were to show that on a graph, it could actually help people look at patterns and actually help display your data and visualize it for other people. So again, we're going to talk about this section more in depth later. So just for now, these are just the different types of ways you can visualize it. So we have a pie chart here, a line chart, a bar graph, and there's a lot more, obviously. So we'll get into that more on. But the next section is data analysis. So like I said, after you have like your data graphed in like a visualized format, you want to analyze the actual results. So for example, if a graph has like a certain slope or a certain shape, you can analyze that in your data analysis section, and you can basically just get at like why did my data end up producing like this, right? So that's like the main idea with the analysis section. And the analysis section is also where you can do statistical tests. Like there's a bunch of different tests, like z-score, r-squared, and t-tests that help you like understand different margins of error, understand like different reasons why your data end up looking like it did. So that's like the essential idea of data analysis. And the most important thing is identifying sources of error. So why was your data slightly lower than expected, or why was your data slightly higher than expected? And you can talk about the different sources of error that led to that. So that brings us to the discussion section. This is essentially just taking your data analysis section and just kind of broadening it and discussing your how your results actually how they affect the world or how they implicate what their implications are in your broader field. So this basically just revisits your original hypothesis and your other research question, and you basically just answer and you get an answer on what all your results actually mean. And then this is also where you can talk about your impact of your results and your real world implications. So that's basically just the discussion section. The last section, and this is probably the most important section in my opinion, is the conclusion slash future work section. So this is basically just where you summarize the paper once more. You use different results, you extrapolate your results and basically analyze them. And this is where you kind of open the scope a bit and you talk about the broader implications of your work and the real world impact that it actually has. So um you basically just reflect on the whole process as a whole. This is just a common scientific practice. And this is also where you can acknowledge any mentors or collaborators that helped you throughout your research. But a really important tip or a really good tip is if you're just going through a bunch of research papers really quickly and you just need ideas for like another project in that field, you can start at the conclusion section because this is where they talk about future works that will do or that they need to do to actually broaden that field. So, this is a really good place just to look for ideas for projects because that's where the actual gaps in our knowledge exist, and that's where researchers acknowledge that. So, this is why the conclusion is super important. And yeah, that was just a little tip if you want to come up with if you need help coming up with an idea. Lastly is the bibliography. This section is basically just citing all your sources, making sure that all your in-text citations match the sources that you cite. And the bibliography is super important because it maintains the standard of science and it maintains scientific integrity. It's also super helpful to look at this part of the paper if you want to just dive deeper into a certain topic, because researchers will obviously cite other past work, and this will help you maybe trace a path that will broaden your understanding of your field. So the bibliography is also a nice place to look at for ideas or just doing background research.